The heart of our talk and the heart of what we're doing with Citizens United and with our director, who's right here, Kevin Knobloch, with whom we've made a number of movies, is that America is at risk. I think this is a very important debate to have, because many of our elites are sleepwalking, as though we are managing at the margins, trivial problems. But the fact is that America is at risk, and I deliberately chose Camus, National Security, and Afghanistan as a title, partly because Calista and I were so influenced when we did a film with Kevin on 9 Days That Changed the World, involving Pope John Paul II's 9-day visit to Poland in 1979, which both Václav Havel and Lech Wałęsa told us was the opening stage of the end of the Soviet Empire, a year and a half before Reagan was elected, and only 1 month after Margaret Thatcher was elected. And as part of the 10-year struggle between the 1979 visit and the 1989 visit, the people of Poland, as they struggled with the dictatorship, developed a very interesting slogan, which I felt was at the heart of what America needs in the near future. Our intellectual leader on this and our policy director at American Solutions is also here, Vince Haley, who passionately fought for us making the movie and fought for the meaning in our generation of John Paul II's pilgrimage to Poland. And part of what he found, and he sent this to me the other day, this is a sign from the 10-year struggle. It basically says, let Poland be Poland. I'm relying on his translation. 2 plus 2 must always mean 4. Now, I know that for a number of you, the concept of 2 plus 2 equals 4, this is the American Solution simple version of it. And this is a bumper sticker. This may seem slightly strange, but I don't think it is, because it really relates to two things. One is the nature of reality, and the other is the importance of telling the truth. Camus wrote in The Plague, there are times when a man can be killed for saying 2 plus 2 equals 4 because the authorities can't stand the truth. And I think that, frankly, our debate over national security in many ways represents that level of establishment pressure to avoid telling the truth. George Orwell wrote 1984 about Great Britain and the dangers of centralized planning leading to tyranny. And in there he has the state torturer say to the innocent citizen who he's torturing, if the state tells you 2 plus 2 equals 15, it equals 5, it equals 5. And if the state tells you 2 plus 2 equals 3, it equals 3. And the citizen is thinking, well, what if it really equals 4? And as many of you know, one of Orwell's most influential essays is on politics in the English language, in which he says, the less defensible a policy, the more obscure the language will be. And there's much, I think, that the national security apparatus and the intellectual institutions of this country would learn by reading Orwell and thinking about it. So I want to discuss Afghanistan, which is the topic of the moment, but I want to discuss it in a way that makes sense historically. And to discuss strategy in Afghanistan without first defining the larger war and outlining a strategy in the larger war would be like discussing Gettysburg without taking into account the Civil War of which it was a part. I think the fact is the United States has 3 great national security challenges, each of which is dramatically different. The first is the threat from radical Islamists, which is what today's speech will mostly focus on. The second is the challenge of competing successfully with China and India in order to sustain the largest, most productive, and most advanced economy in the world, which is the sine qua non of our being able to sustain our national security system. We have had an enormous advantage for at least 160 years of being the largest economy in the world. It enabled us to drown Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. It enabled us to contain and ultimately defeat the Soviet Union. And if we lose that advantage, we will in the long run lose our national security, and we will lose our ability to sustain freedom. The third great challenge is the destructive influence of a secular socialist system. The fact is the secular wing of that system does not want to talk about radical Islamists, and the socialist wing defends reactionary institutions that are incompetent in order to prop them up rather than change them as is needed to compete in the world market. This speech focuses on radical Islamists and their threat to American survival. Other speeches will talk about other components, and other speeches will also expand this. And let me say, I'm going to cite a number of things here, but because it's a relatively, as the topic is so huge, we're going to post a substantial amount of material at our American Enterprise Scholar site under Newt Gingrich, and you'll be able to go there and get a tremendous amount of background material, plus links to other people and other institutions who are engaged in this. I think that we have to keep in mind that any strategy we design to win the struggle with radical Islamists has to also take into account the requirement to rebuild our economy so that we are competitive with China and India. The people who led the Cold War understood this perfectly. If you read the writing of Nitze, or you read George Catlett Marshall, or you read General and then President Eisenhower, they all had a vivid sense that sustaining America's freedom and sustaining America's economic capabilities was integral to the ability to contain the Soviet Empire. That you could not allow yourself to get distorted into a short-term investment as a result of which you went bankrupt. And I think we have to approach this same process, as I will outline in the next few minutes. So we have to design a strategy which is compatible with our success. I think that it's important to recognize in that setting that we are at risk. Now, this is the key precedent to everything else. 31 years after what Mark Bowden called the first battle in America's war with militant Islam, in his book, Guest of the Ayatollah, about the Iranian hostage crisis. 9 years after the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center killed more Americans than have been killed on American soil since 1865. More than Pearl Harbor. We still have not come to grips with where our challenges are. We are in fact more at risk every year because every year that we fail to win, the dangers of a nuclear, chemical, or biological weapon being in the hands of our enemies becomes greater, and they have a learning curve too. So you can't assume that we're brilliant and they're static, because the fact is our opponents are constantly evolving in ways that are going to task us a great deal in the next few years. So I think we have to recognize that our risks are growing greater, not smaller. The key lesson of the Christmas Detroit bomber and the Times Square bomber is that our national security system failed completely. I want you all to think about this. When did we learn that there was a bomber on the airplane over Detroit? When the bomb failed to go off and his pants began to smoke. When did we learn that there was a bomb in Times Square? When the bomb failed to go off and a T-shirt vendor walked up to a policeman. 9 years, billions of dollars, massive reorganization later. And the fact is the national security apparatus failed totally. And that's why this is a really serious problem. And yet there's been no honest assessment of failure. Indeed, nobody has yet been fired for failure to perform, even though it's obvious there have been many failures. And I think the failure of national security should be, frankly, a national scandal. America is at risk of a catastrophic disaster here at home, and that is a reality our elites are hiding from. And so I start from there. And by the way, notice even at a conventional level, a serious, sustained, conventional campaign would cause chaos in this country and lead to dramatic limitations of our freedom and would weaken our economy further in our competition with China and India. I point out to you in terms of asymmetric warfare, a term that people in the Pentagon like to talk about. One shoe bomber has led to an estimated 8 billion pairs of shoes being taken off by innocent people. Now, would you like to calculate the economic reward-cost ratio of that combat? And I warned people at the time, let us hope they don't develop an underwear bomb given that tradition. But luckily, so far since Christmas, TSA has not followed the normal logical pattern of. Yet it's pretty clear that the Obama administration is willfully blind to the nature of our enemies and the forces which threaten America. And I think it's willful because I think, if you look carefully at the Attorney General's comments, if you look at the Homeland Security Advisor, Mr. Brennan's comments, only a person willfully hiding from reality could say these things. So it's not ignorance. It's determined effort to avoid it. But that shouldn't surprise us. Certainly not here at the American Enterprise Institute. The left's refusal to tell the truth about the Islamist threat is a natural parallel to the 70-year pattern of left-wing intellectuals refusing to tell the truth about communism and the Soviet Union. If you go back and look at all the years of disinformation, all the years of denial that were the left's response to communism, why would you think that the next threat to Western civilization will be more accurately studied? It is and this is why the secular socialist system is itself such a threat. It is the natural pattern of secular socialist intellectuals to prefer our opponents to us and to accept their lies over our truths. And if you doubt that, go look at any study of the 70-year period in which the left consistently apologized for the Soviet Empire. And look at the shock of the left when Ronald Reagan described the evil empire. Now, in that context, I want to challenge head-on their use of language, define an alternative use of language, and do so precisely in terms of Camus' 2 + 2 = 4 assertion. Because I think what I'm going to say today is as patently defensible as 2 + 2 = 4, and I think that it is the intellectuals on the left and the policy-making members of our national security establishment who are fundamentally out of touch with reality and in the process endangering the nation. Let me start with Mark Bowden, who wrote Black Hawk Down, and is a great reporter, and wrote Guest of the Ayatollah. He said the following. Now remember, I'm taking you back now, so you understand this is not this week's problem. I'm taking you back 31 years to the Iranian hostage crisis. And here's what Bowden wrote. The capture of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran was a glimpse of something new and bewildering. It was the first battle in America's war against militant Islam, a conflict that would eventually engage much of the world. Iran's revolution wasn't just a localized power struggle. It had tapped a subterranean ocean of Islamist outrage. An ignored but growing vision in the Middle East, nurtured in mosque and madrasa, but considered quaint or backward by the Western world, and even by many wealthy, well-educated Arabs and Persians, saw little difference between the great powers. Both were infidels, godless exploiters, uprooting centuries of tradition and trampling sacred ground in heedless pursuit of wealth and power. They were twin devils of modernity. The Islamist alternative they foresaw was an old twist and a familiar 20th century theme: totalitarianism rooted in divine revelation. It would take many years for the movement to be clearly seen, but the takeover of the embassy in Tehran offered an early glimpse. It was the first time America would hear itself called the Great Satan. Now, most of us who were active in that time, I was a freshman congressman, this was such a vivid public event that Nightline was spawned by covering every single night, ending with night 444 of America held hostage. And yet, intellectually, we couldn't come to grips with it. We couldn't appreciate that this was, in fact, the mainstream of the Iranian regime, which is why those who seek moderates in Tehran among the current dictatorship are engaged in an act of self-delusion of a grand scale, much like looking for moderate Nazis or moderate communists in Moscow. Now, I got engaged fairly early in this. As Callisto was pointing out, I've had a fairly long period of working with the military. My dad was a career soldier. I grew up, among other places, at Fort Riley when the intelligence school was there. And in 1984, I wrote the following in a small book called Window of Opportunity. This is, again, not a this-year problem. This is 26 years ago. The long-term struggle against terrorism will be a dark and bloody one, involving years of vigilant counterterrorism, a level of surveillance and spying that liberals will call intolerable, and a willingness to strike back with substantial force at the originator of the action rather than the foot soldiers of the terrorist movement. That's 26 years ago. So I come to speak to you today